Hey guys, welcome back. Today I'm going to start getting into what we're doing because I haven't talked about this on my channel yet, but this is something that I really feel like needs to be spread around. And me and my wife are actually missionaries. We've been called to go out into all the world and preach the gospel. We've been sent out by our church, Chancy Road Church, to go out there and just make connections. And it's kind of scary because we're really coming out of our comfort zone. But I always say that if it's comfortable, it's probably not God. Because God calls us to come out of the world and come out of the flesh and put into situations where he can refine us and make us into what he wants us to be. And so what we decided to do was just to go out in faith and go where he was calling us to be. And another interesting testimony is that me and my wife, when we first got married, we were together very short time. And then afterwards, COVID happened. And so right from when we got married, we were apart for about 3 years. And in that time, we had to really rely on the Lord and trust in him that he was going to bring us back together. And then after 3 years, we had the opportunity. The Lord said, go, and he made a way. And as soon as we started moving, he made a way and blessed us in our moving. And so we decided to say, okay, we're just going to go anywhere in the world where we can be together and preach the gospel. And so the first place we started was Malaysia, and now we're actually in Vietnam right now, and just making connections and just paving a way for those connections to then start becoming something fruitful for the Lord. And it has been difficult. It has been very difficult because of the climates that we're coming into to preach Jesus. And I come from a church where we do all the time. We are constantly going. We are not just a come on Sunday kind of church. We, at Chancy Road Christian Church, which I would suggest that you take a look because it is a small church, but we are a doing and moving church. And we believe in refining ourselves in the word and constantly, taking who we are and putting it up against the word and constantly dying to ourselves and moving in God's will. And how we did that was every day we were doing something. And for 4 days out of the week, we were out there on the streets preaching the gospel and baptizing people right on the streets. We actually have a mobile baptism trailer that we bring out with us, and we just baptize people right there on the street. And not only that, but we bring out speakers and we just preach the word. And it was amazing to see God move when we moved. And that's what a lot of the church is kind of missing today, is that the church is not moving, so they're not really seeing God move. But when you start moving, oh man, God just starts meeting you where you're at in faith. So I went from pretty much like a 6 days a week of ministry to now coming out here where we can barely move, preaching the gospel. There's so much limitations on the two places that we went to, when it comes to Malaysia and it comes to Vietnam. So I wanted to kind of talk about that and give you guys an understanding of what we've experienced in the climate here in Malaysia and also Vietnam. So the first stop that we did was Malaysia, which was a very interesting place. It was very well developed. It was comfortable as far as just general amenities that you're used to in America. Malls, stores, everything that you possibly need, nice living. It was fine. But when it comes down to preaching the gospel, it was a completely different story, because there you can get arrested if you preach the gospel to the wrong person. See, in Malaysia, it is primarily a Muslim country. It is a I'm sorry. It is a very Muslim country, and that's their main religion. As a matter of fact, when you are born in Malaysia, you're Muslim, period. And if you show signs that you are converting to Christianity, that you have been called out by Christ, and that you are now a Christian, then they can take you away and put you into a like a re-education camp where they try to get you back into the Muslim faith. And not only that, but if you preach to a Muslim, you can be arrested and either kicked out of the country or worse. So it was a very strange climate to be a part of, because we had to be very careful. It's not like we could just go out in the streets and preach Jesus. We had to move carefully and start finding churches. Now, there are churches in Malaysia, but the churches there, which were wonderful, I actually came into a church, and I'm not going to say the church's name. And the reason why is because when I tried to get them to talk about, on video, I actually tried to get an interview with one of these people that says, hey, tell the people back at home what the life is like in the Malaysian church. And they were hesitant to do that, because to come out on video, the authorities, the Malaysian authorities could literally track that down and start asking questions, persecuting, and prosecuting. So when it came down to that, they wouldn't even want me to talk about their name. But an amazing church, amazing people in it, but they have their limitations. They cannot go to a Muslim person and preach Jesus. And they have to be very careful on who they preach Jesus to. Because if somebody walks in and they're a Muslim and people know them as Muslims and they come into their church, the next day someone could be there, the police could be there shutting down their church because they preach to a Muslim preacher. So they have to be very, very careful. Now, on the other hand, we also have people that come out of the Muslim faith and they are believers. The Holy Spirit has called them out. But now what they have to do is that they still have to practice visually as a Muslim and conceal the fact that they are actually Christians. So they still have to practice their faith as a Muslim while knowing that they don't believe in the Muslim faith. They are Christians now. And, but their lives still have to be a Muslim life, a Muslim-led life. And they can't go to other churches because they could get that church in trouble. So that was a very strange atmosphere. And the challenges were very interesting on the way that they handled this. Like they found these underground Muslim churches that they couldn't associate with, but they tried to help out in certain ways, and limitations on what they can do there. But it's amazing the way that the Muslim church or the Muslim faith works in that area, because it is all Muslim. So as soon as you're born in Malaysia, you're a Muslim. But not only that, but they're very they really go out and they try to make Muslims out of any other areas of Malaysia. So there are these tribes in Malaysia, like back in the country area of Malaysia. And these tribes are not developed. They don't really have the amenities as they do in like the big city. And the big cities are they're big cities. They're just like we have back in the United States. They have everything and more that we have. And beautiful, absolutely beautiful. But, there are parts of the country where they're completely undeveloped, no infrastructure at all. And so these Muslim parts of the government go out there and they say, we will give you infrastructure. We will give you schools. We will give you running water. We'll give you electricity. We'll give you everything you need. But you have to come into the Muslim faith. And because of that, they will probably say no. They usually will say either no or they will either try to, kind of pass it off because they don't want it. They don't want that kind of control. And so they will forfeit all infrastructure just to avoid being indoctrinated into the Muslim faith just legally indoctrinated into the Muslim faith. And then they will say, okay, you don't want to be a Muslim? Well, you're not going to get water. You're not going to get food. You're not going to get everything you need to build your town or your village. And some villages are actually fine with that, but some are suffering because they don't want to become Muslim, but the government will not help them out until they do convert to the Muslim faith. So, it was very interesting to see the contrast. And I was talking to this guy, and again, I won't say his name because I don't want to implement him into anything. And I don't want him to be found out in any way. He has to kind of go under the radar. But a wonderful man. He's in charge, or one of the people in charge of the missionary work that this church does. And he sat down and talked with me because I was very interested to hear about the climate. And he was telling me about how the struggle that they have with the Malayans, their language, that you cannot, the Malayan language, like people that are Malay are the Malayan language, they will not have full concept of reading and writing, in other languages. So most of them won't know how to read English or read other languages. So when it comes down to it, they won't allow Bibles to be printed in the Malayan language. Now, there still are, of course, there still are Bibles that are printed out in the Malayan language, but yet you have to have a certain license to sell those because those are strictly monitored. And so that was one of the restrictions that they had there. And he kind of went through all the other restrictions that they have, like how do they preach the gospel? How do they, in such a climate where they even have to wear masks all the time, they have to social distance still. You don't really have to do this when you go, you have to wear a mask when you go into a mall. You have to wear a mask when you go into a car with somebody. Okay, fine. But when you eat or drink, of course, you don't have to wear a mask. And that's fine. But when you're in a church, you got to wear a mask. I was wondering if I didn't see anything happening in the mosque, but I'm wondering if they have the same things that they do in the mosque. Do they treat mosque and church the same, or do they have better treatment? Can they take off their mask when they come into mosque? I'm not too sure. So the struggles that they have with preaching the gospel to these places, they have to be very precise. They have to be gentle as doves and wise as serpents. There are certain things that they need to be respectful of the rulers that God has put in place in that country. They have to be respectful of that and the laws that they have. I was just talking about today how a lot of Christian believers believe that we need to fight against the government law and stand up against the government law. Well, I know that a lot of people will think I'm very wrong about this, but that's not biblical. It's not. We are called to be a holy people in the midst of the ungodly world. We are meant to be holy as he is holy, and then watch the Lord fight our battles. Now, there are certain times where we do need to stand up and say, no. And that's, we don't worship any other gods, right? Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, they did not bow down to the idol statue of Nebuchadnezzar, or even Daniel, right? They said that there was a law that he couldn't do his worship. He couldn't pray and worship in public. He couldn't do it outwardly because he had to do it towards Jerusalem. And so if he did that publicly, he could be arrested. And so, but he did it anyway, because that was his faith. He would not bow at some point. But there's also in Jeremiah where he's calling out to people, and he says that this is the judgment that you are going to be, that the people, the chosen people of God, are going to be under the rule of an ungodly ruler, Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. He says, but I want you to go there and accept this judgment and be holy in the midst of the judgment. And I want you to pray for their peace, because that'll give you peace. And so in ungodly nations, in nations where we are in ungodly rulers, just like the United States, we are amidst ungodly rulers, but those are still God's appointed rulers. God's not upstairs and going, wait, Joe Biden is president? No, he knows, because he appointed that. And the way that America has accepted certain horrible atrocities and made them commonplace into our culture and even into our churches, sometimes I feel like that's just God's judgment on these rulers, is going to be God's judgment. And we need to understand and not fight back with that judgment, but be holy in the midst of judgment and be separated in the midst of judgment. And so these people in Malaysia, they are constantly struggling to be respectful to the power and the law of the land, while also doing what God has called them to do, meeting all the time, making sure that they come together and preach and baptize, and they find ways to baptize people. And so my heart really goes out to those, to the Malayans, that they, and the church that I went to, is that, man, they really needed to walk that line and have spiritual discernment to know what to do and what not to do, to be respectful, but to also be holy. So that was a very interesting situation, but it was also very frustrating, because I go from preaching the gospel all the time and going out there and speaking boldly about it to all of a sudden needing to be silenced in a certain way and only being able to preach in certain environments. And that was very hard for me. But I sat down with this guy, one of the leaders in the missionary area, and he was saying, like, you guys are so lucky that you guys have all of this freedom to go out there and preach the gospel and to be the church and to just go anywhere you want and baptize people on the street. He says, you guys are so lucky. And I said, just because that America has that freedom, it doesn't mean that they're making the most out of that freedom. Because the American church, this has been a huge eye opener for me, is that the church in America has that freedom, and yet they're not moving in that freedom. They're still just coming to service every day and staying quiet. See, the reason why the American government's not fighting against the church too much is because the American church has already been silenced under their own will. They don't want to get too extreme. They don't want to discomfort themselves too much, to go out there on a hot day and preach the gospel, or in a cold weather and preach the gospel, or in the rain and preach the gospel. That's why we need to pray to the Lord of the harvest that he will send people out into the harvest field. We need to pray for that, because there is just not enough, but yet the harvest is white and ready to be plucked. And yet we are not moving. And there's so few people that are willing to move. And yet where people are willing to move, they're not able. So we have to pray to the Lord of the harvest. That scripture has come out so much more in my life because of that. Lord, just send them out, bring people where I am, and let's make something happen. So, but until then, what we have to do while I'm out here in these countries is to pray and to be a light in this country, and to inspire and to learn and to watch God just move in the midst where the enemy doesn't want us to move. And yet God just moves anyway. I just have to be obedient. We all just have to be obedient and watch God move. So that was a little bit about what happened in Malaysia. But then after that, we went to Vietnam. And Vietnam was actually a little bit harder because they're a communist government, and they really don't like you talking to Vietnamese people about the gospel. They have churches, but they're Catholic churches, and they don't want, they're strictly monitored. See, the enemy doesn't mind Catholic churches, right? Because it's mostly about idolatry anyway. It's mostly about statues and, praying to this statue or that statue or this person or that person. And the enemy doesn't seem to ever mind Catholic churches. That's one thing I've noticed. If you go to Malaysia, the enemy, Muslims, they don't mind Catholic churches. Go ahead. You're a Catholic? Oh, yeah, go ahead. No problem at all. They don't mind. Enemy's okay in a Catholic church. And that really needs to be a wake up for us and also people that are in a Catholic church. Why is it that the enemy is okay with you guys? Why is it that the world has no problem with Catholic churches? Like they will let, now I'm not talking about people, like some people like don't like religion anyway, and they always talk bad about the Catholic Church. I understand. But yet when it comes down to governments, the powers of this world, they have no problem with Catholic churches. Interesting. And so when it comes to Vietnam, they don't want you preaching at all here. And see, I can meet up with other believers that are tourists, right? Like I just met up with this guy today, and we just had fellowship, and we prayed out in this tiny little coffee shop, kind of tucked away into the corner of this little slummy area, and we just sat there and we held hands and we prayed. We just prayed together, prayed for each other. And if the government saw us doing that, they'd be like, okay, fine. That's fine. Because you can pray with another foreigner. That's fine. But don't come and try to preach Jesus to a Vietnamese person, because they don't want you to speak to locals. You come, you do your thing, because you're going to leave anyway. You can't stay here. You got to leave anyway. So you can come. You're not going to make any difference. But when it comes to preaching to Vietnamese people, that's a completely different story. And so I started talking to this guy. His name was Diego. Wonderful guy. We went out and did a fellowship with his family. Wonderful family. He's from India. And he has great testimony. His family, great testimony, and just a sweet people. And we went out to talk with him, and he was telling me how hard it was to find a church, like an actual church, a fellowship. See, the church that I went to, I actually had to know a person that knows a person. And then I had to find that church and then send a message to the pastor. And then he gave me the address. And it's not even called a church. It's called a fellowship. Right? So it's like, I won't even say the name. Again, I don't want to say the names of these places because I don't want to implement them. I don't want the government to look into this and see that, okay, this church is making a difference. But this church that we went to, I had to find somebody that knew somebody that knew somebody. And this church is not in a building. It's actually in a house, a very big, beautiful house, like kind of in this ritzy area. And we worship up at the top floor, and wonderful people there. And it's an English speaking church. And this guy, Diego, was telling me how long it took him to find a place, because most people wouldn't tell him where to go. He says, you're a foreigner. So like he was talking to this pastor that was in Japan, a Japanese pastor that was there, I guess. And he said that, Diego was trying to say, where can I find a good church? And he says, why do you need to find a church? You're leaving anyway. Why do you need to find a church? And he says, I don't care if I'm here for a day. I don't care if I'm here for a year. I need to be with believers. And so, he found a guy that found a guy, and he was finally able to find the church. So even I had to send an email to the pastor, and he had to send me the directions, because if you look on Google, the directions that it gives you doesn't take you to the place. It takes you to the vicinity of kind of where it is, but not exactly to the place. And so that's the climate that people need to have here. That's the kind of mentality that people need to have. They need to be very, very careful. The man who started this church is actually not even allowed to be in that church, because he's not a Vietnamese person. He got kicked out of the country. He's, I think he was English, and he started up the church and got kicked out of the church because they found out what he was doing. And so the only way to keep that church going is that he had to appoint a Vietnamese pastor there. And so they meet every Sunday. And now the one thing I will say about the Vietnamese the culture is that there is no rest. There's no rest here. It's everybody just goes a million miles an hour. Like we're used to people back at home. You know, you have your slow days and you have your fast days. You know, you have maybe Mondays are a little bit slower, or Sundays are very slow because most people are at church and most people rest on Sundays to an extent. But not here. From sun up to sundown, from sun up to late at night, every single day of the week, everybody is going as hard as possible, and there is no rest. And I tried to meet with a lot of people from the church, and the one thing that I got the most was, I'm busy, you know, and I don't blame that on them. I don't blame that on them. They were wonderful people, but yet that's what the world does, is it keeps you busy. Keeps you busy. You know, the one thing that I keep hearing all the time is how the end times church is going to be pretty much worn down, right? It says that in Daniel, how he will try to wear down the saints, and almost to the point of death. He will wear down the saints. And what I keep hearing all the time is this frog soup. Frog soup, you know, how a frog soup is made. They don't put the frogs in boiling water, otherwise they would just jump out. And so what they do to cook the frogs is that they would put it into water and just slowly turn the heat up until, you know, so the frogs will just sit in the water until it gets so hot that they just die. And that's what the enemy is doing, is just slowly turning it up. And it's doing that by keeping you busy. Keeping you busy. Just go harder. Try to afford that extra car. Try to afford that extra large place. Try to get that extra bill in. You know, now you need a new phone. Now you need a new, you know, just go into a little bit more debt just to cover yourself, you know, to get you a little bit further. And it just keeps going and going and going. And most Christians are so afraid to lose everything they have that they will just work themselves to death to try to keep everything they have. And that's what I'm seeing so much here, is that the enemy has just been running them ragged, running them down, turning up the heat until finally they just have no more left. They can't have fellowship anymore. They can't go out and preach the gospel. They are so tired and exhausted because the world just keeps on moving. It's just like what happened in Exodus, right? The Pharaoh starts overworking, like when Moses is calling out, and Moses is this voice of God, right? Just like in Exodus, God says to Moses that you will be like God unto Pharaoh. And so Moses, the God figure towards Pharaoh, is calling his people out and trying to get him out of the world. And so because there's a probability that the people are trying to escape the world, what does the ruler of that world do? He overworks the people of God. So he just keeps on stacking up the work and stacking up the work and stacking up the work. And that's what's happening in these end times, is that the Lord is calling people out in massive numbers. People are coming to Christ in so many random places of the world that you wouldn't even believe even if you knew. And yet the ruler of this world knows. So he knows that because the more God is calling people out of the world, just like Moses was calling people out of Egypt, the Pharaoh, or the rulers of this world, the pharaohs of this world, are now stacking on the workload of the people, keeping them busy, keeping them going, and stopping them from going to worship God. Because that's what Moses was trying to get them to do. Let my people go so they can go into the wilderness and worship God. So that's the one thing I see in this busy climate, that the people of God are busy in the world. And the one thing I would say to that, for all of us who are so busy with our jobs, so busy with our work weeks, so busy with doing things for our children and doing things for our work and doing things for our neighbors and doing things for this and that and the other thing. Remember that that's what the enemy wants you to do. He wants to keep you occupied and keep you busy and keep you running. He wants to keep you from rest. He wants to keep you from doing work. The only way that you are going to be re-strengthened are the people that are walking with God and walking in faith. They are going to have strength again. But everybody that is walking in the world is going to be worn down until finally the temperature is so hot that we just can't do anything. My pastor just had this great sermon, Pastor Tim at Chancey Road Church. And he said he's been having contractions being put in his mind. Contractions. And the thing about contractions, when because the world is travailing like a woman in labor, it says. And the thing about a woman in labor is that they have contractions, and when contractions come around, they are unable to move. They are unable to speak. There's just so much pain that they just tense up and they can't do anything. And then the contraction subsides, and then they're able to talk again. They're able to move again. They're able to communicate. We saw a contraction in 2020. We saw that the world just stiffened up real quick, and we weren't able to preach the gospel. We weren't able to go out and baptize. We weren't able to do anything. And it's like everything went silent. And then things eased up, and then we got back into the swing of things. The next contraction is going to come again. But right now, we have the capability, we have the time in between contractions to speak and to move and to go out mightily into all the world and to preach the gospel and to baptize all that believe and strengthen our brotherly bonds. Start bringing back together brotherly bonds and making sure that we are growing in the love of the brethren. And we have that time right now. Don't let this world keep you busy. Matter of fact, start practicing going away from your world. Commit to ministry at least once a day, or at least pick a day and commit on that day to absolute ministry. That day is absolutely for God and nothing else. And then when you start getting used to your schedule, moving around your schedule to that ministry, I'm not talking about Sunday. That's a given. I'm talking about another day. And you dedicate that day to God and prayer and ministry and serving others. And then when you get used to that, commit another day and another day. And before you know it, you're putting more time in the kingdom than you are in the world. Do it while you're still able to do it. Practice it now, because one day it's going to be real. And right now there are people around the world that don't have the freedom that you have, that can't go out there and preach the gospel and baptize people right now. And I would just love to be in that moment where I could say, today I'm just going to go out on the side of the road and preach the gospel. But I can't, because the climates that we're in. I have to. There are people in Vietnam, there are people in Malaysia that are dying for the opportunity that you may have right now at your home. Go out there, preach the gospel, and get something done, and start harvesting that harvest, because it is white and ready. There are people that need to be saved. So, with that being said, our next stop is going to be Kazakhstan, of all places. The Lord called us to Kazakhstan, and I'm going to talk more about that soon. And I'm going to keep you guys updated with our missions trip to Kazakhstan. And I can't wait to see how the Lord moves. And we'll keep you posted. We'll kind of give you updates throughout. And not only that, but we'll still have our Bible teachings. We'll still go through the witnesses. We're still going to go up through many other Bible topics, and also the continual reading of the Word, which is very important. So stay tuned for more videos, and I'll talk to you soon. God bless, guys.